Hey everyone, Professor Snart checking in as we get right down to the end of our English 22-26 Masterpieces of World Lit class. Here, so we have just a couple of units left, and I'm just going to get into our due dates here. We are currently working on Unit 9. Well, I guess it depends on when you're watching this, but we are working on or just finished Unit 9. Challenging dominance, which has us looking at maybe the most contemporary and in some ways accessible works that we've read from the course. Although one interesting thing that I think I mentioned before and people probably noticed with Unit 8, which is also about the so-called modern world, is that despite the fact that certain things are more contemporary feeling about some of those readings, like they exist in forms that we're more familiar with. The authors that we read are writing in genres that we're familiar with or responding to historical or cultural circumstances that we're maybe a little more familiar with, if not directly, then at least through, sort of secondhand educational experience and that kind of thing. But certainly if you think of the work of T.S. Eliot, Kafka, Sartre, some of those people that we read, they are content-wise in many ways, and even sort of form-wise, a lot more challenging than even some of the earliest stuff that we read. And so you really get a sense of how, like the creation myths, one of the earliest things that we read in the course, for example, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it in this very broad terms, that kind of writing, where a culture looks to grapple with some of the most fundamental questions about who are we, why are we here, where we come from, where are we going, it doesn't really make sense to present that document or to present the thinking about those questions in elusive or allusive terms, which is precisely what we find in some of those so-called modern or contemporary authors, someone like Eliot, for example. Part of his whole theory of art is to present itself as difficult for the reader. So in some ways, while those modern authors may be more accessible or at least familiar in terms of the circumstances out of which they wrote, they quite consciously produce work that is meant to be challenging and difficult and in some ways inaccessible, which sounds really, I guess the worst part of it is it sounds really elitist, and which is precisely what some of those authors like Eliot were charged with and still are charged with, that they're very elitist, that you have to have had a certain, not just education, but a certain kind of education to really have access to their work in its fullest meanings. I don't think that that's really true, and nor did Eliot really argue for that if you read him in the fuller context, but you can certainly excerpt a few choice quotations from his essays about art or about poetry specifically that really do make him seem quite interested in turning readers off of his work, which some of you might have found. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we've been through a period in our course here where authors might be more accessible in some ways, but are much more challenging in other ways. And if you think about the broad kind of spectrum of where we've come from and now where we are, you can see that kind of artistic ideal, not just in isolation, but in this larger, again, a larger kind of framework. Okay, so moving forward then, we look at Unit 9 and then finally Unit 10, which has us do a few more readings, but the writing that you're doing is not specific just to those readings. You're doing kind of a final reflection essay or hopefully video response, which I'll say more about in just a second. But it's a fairly conventional or typical kind of final essay, a what did you learn in this course kind of a thing. I'll let you read all the details in there. But one of the things I introduced in the Unit 9 was the option to do a video essay. So just like I'm doing here, except more organized. Instead of writing your essay, you'd be sort of speaking it with notes for yourself, not just reading the essay that you've written verbatim. So it would be, more formal than this maybe, but maybe not a whole lot. And in fact, we've had, as of my recording of this, we've had at least one student who's posted a video essay, and it works really well, just technically. Hopefully he will come into the discussion board here in Unit 9 and maybe provide some guidance about the steps he took and how long it took and was it difficult or was it not. Hopefully not, but sometimes the first time you do things, especially computer-wise, it's like if you don't already know what you're doing or how to do it, it seems really laborious. But hopefully that wasn't his experience. And hopefully it won't be the experience for people who would also like to try this option, either for writing or for doing the essay response for Unit 9, for responding to other students, which might be an easier way to kind of get into that video mode because you're not having to, rehearse this entire essay or speak this entire essay. Or for the final unit, I've also added the possibility, if you want to do your final essay in video form, again, like what I'm doing here, or the response portion in video form, or both in video form. I really hope people will take advantage of that. I think, again, it's just a really nice way of still achieving the basic course objectives of like being able to speak knowledgeably about the readings that we've done and see interconnections and all the things that you would do in written form. But it really, really brings the course to life in terms of like a group of people who are encountering this material together. And I've just also sent an email out regarding this. If you want to log into the Unit 9 discussion board and look at the video essay that's been posted by Jason, and again, there might be others there that will show up after I've recorded and posted this, so my apologies if I didn't include you in that group. But you'll just see immediately, even if you don't really pay attention to the content of what he's saying, just to have that presence of him speaking and thinking about the ideas that he wants to talk about and identifying the texts that he's engaged, and even his initial thesis of the challenging dominance being more refined in terms of challenging oppression, just to have that idea sort of spoken to you. It's really like the difference between that and just reading this big chunk of text is really profound. So hopefully more people will do that video thing, even though I realize that it's kind of intimidating even in the best of circumstances. But when you're already under the gun in a course like ours in terms of just churning these things out so quickly back to back to back, in many ways the last thing you want to do is take on a new or introduce a new technical challenge for yourself. Again, hopefully that won't be too intimidating for most people. And like I've tried to stress here in the course itself, I appreciate the effort in undertaking that technical challenge. So I don't know how to say this gracefully, but it's almost like the grading really changes for the video side of it, just because I appreciate you having taken on that particular challenge. So it doesn't mean an automatic 100% necessarily, but it gets you pretty close. Let's put it that way, just between you and me. Okay, so that's where we've been, the video part. All right, how's my time looking here? Okay, I'm doing pretty good. So the one kind of bigger idea that I wanted to present to you, which I've done sort of throughout some of these video announcements, is yet another challenge that we face in terms of teaching or taking a course like this. And you'll find if you're one of those people who is currently a teacher or will be, or will in any form be, having to confront the idea of teaching something like the masterpieces of world literature, any sort of world lit, really any kind of lit, but I think this particular problem is really, it takes on even kind of greater importance in the world lit scene. So this is one of those very big questions that might actually have some very particular implications or applications depending on your circumstance. And as with many of the issues I've introduced before, there's no right answer. There's no kind of perfect balance to be struck, and that there's some secret knowledge out there that you will get or that I've got that I could give to you. It's one of those things that I introduce as a question, not for you to solve or resolve in any way, but that becomes kind of an integrated and ongoing part of your thinking about this and maybe even your teaching of this. And that's the notion of World Lit being, this kind of course being like a window to the world of these various cultures and civilizations and time periods. And I think often I've even spoken in those terms of we get, through our readings, a sort of glimpse of a particular culture and a particular time period. And I don't think that's wrong necessarily, but one of the things that you want to be really careful of is taking that too far, as if by reading about, one excerpt from one text from one culture, that we suddenly have kind of a breadth of knowledge about that culture. And again, it's not like we say, well, okay, we read one thing and that's all we know. So certainly we gain some information and perspective about that culture. But we don't want to take that so far to think that, well, since we've read the Ramayana, we have knowledge of Indian culture now, or literature. Since we've read Gilgamesh, we know all there is to know about ancient Sumeria, or whatever the case might be. And so I'll give you a very specific example from my own teaching. I think I bought into this notion of World Lit being a series of windows onto these various cultures, and that if I only provided enough historical, cultural, etc. background, that the perspective that you got out that window would get fuller and fuller and fuller, so the more I added, the better it became. So if you think there's a lot of stuff in the course as it exists now, you should have seen it before. It was too much. It was way too much. But I fell into the trap of really thinking that the more information I could pack into each of those windows, if you want to mix the metaphors or whatever, the more students would learn. And so I've backed away from that, which seems sort of counterintuitive, that I actually I'm less interested in teaching a whole bunch of cultural, historical, and all that sort of social background. There's certainly some of that that's important, but it's the law of diminishing returns. We could keep reading about medieval Europe, but it's not like at some point we'll finally learn everything there is to learn about medieval Europe, and thus our reading of some of that middle period stuff will be better or will be more productive for us somehow. So again, it sort of sounds counterintuitive that in some ways, if you teach a World Lit class, you need to not pretend that you're providing this window into all these civilizations and cultures, but offer that as a kind of possibility, and then in tandem with the fact that we always acknowledge that what we get is really just a piece of things. And that's okay. Like, there's no possibility to resolve that problem. But notice how it has direct implications for, like in my case, what this course looked like, what components were in each of the units, the workload for students, the workload for me in terms of trying to know all this stuff. It's impossible on some level. And it's not that we then pretend that that problem doesn't exist, or that I pretend that I do know all this stuff off the top of my head. A lot of it is buried in there, so I can unlock it, and in the right context, I'll know a lot of stuff about Indian literature, for example. But it's not like I could play Trivial Pursuit and have all of that knowledge at my fingertips, and nor would you as a teacher, and nor should you expect yourself to, nor would I ever expect students to. So again, this very broad, abstract kind of question has very particular kinds of applications that really affect like the very course that you're now taking, or the course that you might teach in the future. So the whole window to the world thing is maybe productive to a point, but it's also one of those kind of academic myths that we need to not get rid of, but just be aware of. And sort of foreground instead of hiding it, like, oh, we're just going to pretend that it doesn't exist, or that it's a problem with this right answer, that if we just fiddle stuff exactly right, then we'll get it, perfect. It really doesn't work like that. So I thought I'd share that because I think it's an interesting big idea to think about. It might have particular implications and applications for your own teaching now or in the future. And it's also something ongoing that I think about all the time is, what does it mean for me to be the professor of a course that's called Masterpieces of World Literature? There's a lot of assumptions that can go along with that are, like I've said, productive to a point, but we also need to interrogate on an ongoing basis. So anyway, I'll leave you with that to think about. And again, if you're interested in trying out the video thing, I really encourage you to give it a go. Be in touch with me, use the discussion board in here, and even if you don't take on the challenge for Unit 9, maybe think about it for Unit 10, which would be nice, sort of our final unit. Try something maybe a little bit new to reflect on the ground that we've covered so far. Okay, so we're getting right to the end, so stay focused and be in touch if you have any questions or concerns.